Our MC said this is about having active participation from yourselves, so let's get you all warmed up. If you're able to, can you please stand? Great. Okay, so I want to get the room charged and stimulated, so I've got a few questions for you, please. So please stay stood up if you agree with what I'm going to say, or sit down if you disagree. So my first question, greater collaboration can reduce fragmentation and improve standardization. So stay stood up if you agree with that, or sit down if you disagree. Okay, that's a good start. My second question then is AI can help us use data more effectively. That's a great thing. Okay, and my last question for you all is, it is our collective responsibility to continually seek improvements in safety, sustainability, and welfare. Okay, well, that's great because we have unity across everyone, so please give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. Samuel, good morning. Can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me back?
Yes, we can hear you, Samuel. Thank you for joining. Okay, let's make a start. So, shipping continues to transport 90% of world trade. And please excuse me, I am going to position myself this way so I can see Samuel on the screen as well. Shipping continues to support 90% of world trade. Behind that global trade are around 1.9 million seafarers and around 1.5 million global stevedores and dock workers. And the maritime industry has never been short of commitments. Today we're seeing more initiatives, more standards, and more data on safety, sustainability, and crew welfare than at any point. Yet fragmentation remains a defining challenge. Today there are inconsistent standards, duplicate processes and requests, and hundreds of data sources, all often aimed at collecting, analysing and reporting similar data for different stakeholders. How and where we source data and how it is structured and integrated directly shapes what we see, how we assess risk, and ultimately guides the decisions that we take. However, accessing data, improving transparency, and fostering greater collaboration to unlock value is not always straightforward. And at the centre of data-driven collaboration sits a single critical factor, as Steen highlighted, trust. And many people across shipping still agree that the system is fragmented, complex, and at times hard to trust. I'm Andrew Roberts, and I'm delighted to moderate this opening session today, where together we'll explore how safety, sustainability, and crew welfare are evolving, and ask whether our current approaches across data, initiatives, and commitments are truly delivering a more aligned, transparent, and trusted outcome. Joining me, as you've heard, I have Steen Lund, CEO of RightShip, John Platzidakis, Honorary Chairman of Intercargo, and Mr. Samuel McSkimming, CEO of Pilbara Ports Authority. So thank you. Okay, let's get going. Steen, I'm going to come to yourself first, if I may, carrying on from your opening session there. If we take away reports, platforms, pledges, in your view, what has actually changed in the last 5 years around ships, ports, and the industry as a whole?
So I'll try to not let my voice be the one that gets heard all the time on the panel here. You've had 10 minutes of me, so I'll try to be brief. And I'm saying that also because we had really looked forward to having Samuel on the panel, and we have this awkward moment now, Samuel, where I'm looking down here and I'm seeing a screen, and I don't know where you're looking at us, but it would have been lovely to have had you in the room and made the connection in person here. I personally look really forward to hearing from a significant terminal infrastructure how challenges look and what we should do about them. But obviously, as I said in my opening, we are rich in data, but we are relatively poor in evidence that we are yet at a point where all that is available to us is evidenced to lead to significant improvements. And if we look at just some of the specifics that is available with us, then certainly I mentioned 232 known fatalities in a year, and that is staggering. We all know that the suicide rates in the maritime industry is substantially higher than it is in comparable land-based industries. So there is still work to be done around those two absolutely staggering data points. We continue to see evidence that port state control detentions are on the rise, not falling, and I very much appreciate that not all port state control regimes around the world are homogeneous in how they interpret their roles, but nonetheless, we have an issue at hand where they find reason to suggest that vessels are not safe during the work that they do. So all that aggregates into one of, in RightShips, our biggest take-homes from that is the seafarer is constantly paying the price and is at the center of a lot of negativity. On top of it, of course, sort of from a geopolitical point of view, we go from crisis to crisis, right? We've lived through COVID and a Red Sea crisis and piracy crises, and currently a lot of confusion around the crisis in the Middle East. Should I stay or should I go? And those who attempt to go also almost daily are reported to pay a really significant price for that. So again, although data is available to us, we do have a lot of evidence that it's not working, and that's sad. And the last part, I also, it would be remiss to not mention that in trying to become incredibly efficient as a supply chain, the seafarer also pays the price from inadequate shore leave. And again, perhaps also that leads to some of the social ills that we are registering with them.
Thank you, Steen. And I think great to reflect back across those things. I think everyone would agree that those signals are very unnerving, particularly around abandonment and fatalities. I'm not sure if we still have Samuel. Can you hear us? No. Okay. Well, we transfer that. John, let me turn to yourself. Reflecting back across the last 5 years, what is your view on where we've come and how things around safety, sustainability, and crew welfare have moved?
Hello?
There we go. I think we got you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. Let me position first myself. I've been in shipping since 1981 as Executive Bank of America financing shipping, but in actual shipping since '89. So my reflection over those years is that shipping is a safe industry. When you consider the magnitude of the workload, the number of vessels and the crew involved, I think it's a safe industry. Of course, the numbers are numbers, and I trust them. But at the end of the day, we have, in order to build the data, as the theme is, the title is about, is not if data can build trust, is if data can be trusted, and if they actually reflect the reality. Of course, 232 people is a big number. There's no doubt about it, and I wish it was 200 or 100. But when you take into account that there must be about how many ocean-going ships, 80,000, 100,000, you name it. Possibly at this very moment, we're talking about a crowd of crew of about 2.5 million people at any single time. So it means that there is one seaman among those 232 that perishes within every 2 days. Is it bad? Of course it's bad. I wish it was less than that. But driving to work this morning, I had about fatalities in Ukraine and the Middle East of about a dozen people killed by rockets, and certainly many more that went unreported. So I feel that shipping is a safe industry. Does it have room for improvement? Yes, certainly. Everything has room for improvement. It's a full audience today. Could we improve it? Certainly. There is a couple of seats empty, so I wish they were full. That same applies to over the last 3-5 years that you mentioned, Andrew. Yes, there has been improvement. Of course, people are more aware, there are more reports, there is more consistency from the management companies, more pressure on the seamen to perform better from the classification societies, the banks, RightShip, you name them, the terminals, the charters, etc. So it has, yes, we're doing well. Can we do better? Certainly. Is it bad where we stand? No, it's not. It's okay for the time being.
Thank you, John. I think that's a great springboard into how we're going to talk about how we can do better throughout the panel. We've lost Samuel, so let me please contrast some of the discussion that I had with Samuel ahead of the session. So, Samuel's view really of where we've come in the last 5 years is there has been quite a broad reimagining of shipping. There's been continual reinforcement where, in Samuel's words, the average punter is reminded of the importance of the global supply chain. And I think Samuel's view is when you look across some of the challenges we've seen currently within the Middle East, if you go back and look at events that happened in the Suez Canal or in the US last year, where they really shine a line on the fragility of the system, his view is very much that it takes those types of events, unfortunately, sometimes to define just how important the industry is. Let me move us into then this notion.
Andrew?
Hello?
Hi, Andrew. It's Sam here. I can actually hear you, but I don't think you can see me. Can you hear me back?
We can hear you, Samuel, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I understand the hotel Wi-Fi is a bit fussy.
Please, we've just moving into our second session here, Samuel. So I will bring you in a few minutes, if that's okay.
Okay, no problem.
Great. Okay, so I want to move into talking about fragmentation. So, John, do you think the industry is becoming more aligned, or do you think it is more fragmented?
It is fragmented, but I think there is a better understanding among its participants to address the problems. But to be fully aligned, I think it's an objective that it's almost impossible to achieve. Look at the United Nations. Is it fragmented? Certainly it is. Can they have one voice? Certainly not. So the same applies to shipping. But on the other hand, this fragmentation is an advantage, I think, because there are many views expressed. There's a challenging debate. You've seen what is happening about the greenhouse gases. Irrespective of the outcome, there were millions of hours spent on it. But it was worth the discussion, I think, at the end of the day. So the fragmentation is positive. The collaboration could be better. But again, there are many interests. The objectives of the various participants are different. You cannot expect the charters and the ship owners and the crew and you name them to have the very same objective. Of course, you may have a generic statement that we want safety. Okay, fair enough. It was interesting to hear, Steen, when you said certain charters say that the profit margins is so thin that they cannot afford to pay for better vessels. What an excuse. I did recall a question some 20 years ago to a very senior executive of an oil major, whether he was talking about quality, blah, blah, blah. And I asked him whether his company would be willing to pay a premium for quality ships. And he was very open, and I appreciated that. He said, certainly not. So you see, the objectives are different, okay? they have their own profit margins, they have their own objectives. Yeah.
Do you think the fragmentation makes it more difficult, though, John, to drive standards in safety, sustainability, and welfare?
No, I don't think that today there is a conflict of opinions about improvement in safety, for example. But of course, safety, there are certain limits that we have to put upon. It's the same like data. Okay, there is a limit of how far do you go. If I want to be absolutely safe, most probably I shouldn't drive to work. I should stay home, hopefully without an earthquake. So there are limits as well. But of course, a number of, in terms of incidents, when we report 232 fatalities, I think that a number of those are attributed to the very same persons that suffered. It's incompetence, it's lack of attention, and there are certain limits how far you can go when you deal with humans.
And maybe we'll pull on that in a few minutes, John, a bit more. Steen, you'd mentioned there in your opening comments around detentions, and we see the detentions going up. But Samuel, I want to come to yourself. We do see a lot of fragmentation around ports, port state control. From your perspective and where you sit today, do you feel that the industry is becoming more aligned or complex when it comes to safety, sustainability, and crew welfare?
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Great. Well, look, I think that's a big question, and it doesn't have a simple answer. And I think the reason for that is that every port, at least certainly the very big ones in the world, but even the small ones, are part of very different markets, and they attract very different types of vessels, and they're supported by very different economics. And so my sort of sense of the world at the moment is we're seeing divergence, not convergence, in the way in which ports think about risk. We're seeing larger ports that are more important to systemic risk around the economy, investing more and more in safety controls, investing more and more in technology to try to manage some of these major systemic risks. Smaller ports, supported by less profitable trades, are not necessarily in a position to do that. And so I think that there is actually more divergence and convergence in how ports think about risk at this present state of time. And I don't necessarily see an easy way of fixing that. What we see at the moment in the Strait, what you would see in the Pilbara, what you see in various other ports around the world, on, say, the west coast of the United States or some of the largest Chinese ports, is very, very significant concentrations of systemic risk. And those ports, quite rightly, take a very different view of how that risk might be managed vis-a-vis their relationship with owners and managers than much smaller ports that are competing much more aggressively for business and are much more readily able to be bypassed by both shippers and shipping companies. And so I actually think we're more at danger at the moment, Andrew, of leaving behind parts of the world as we advance in this journey towards collaboration, data and safety improvement, more than we are in a position where we can say things are getting better uniformly.
Thank you, Samuel. John, you mentioned about the IMO as well. We do see difference in standards. Samuel, just staying with you whilst we've got you. Do you see, and if so, where do you see ports end up compensating or stepping up to actually fill in the gaps from the system elsewhere?
Yeah, I can absolutely see that, particularly I think with ports like ours where they have a role in systemic global risk. So for those that don't know the Pilbara, it's responsible for about 50% of the world's iron ore trade. And so if we stop, in much the same way as we're now seeing in the Strait at the moment, very significant part of the world's supply chain stops as well. And so in that context, ports are very, very alive to systemic risk, and they try to manage it in relation to their particular local environment. Now, that can be both very helpful because what it does is allows that particular trade, that particular region to achieve step change in its risk management. But what it can also do is move them well beyond where the IMO might be. And so again and again, our experience looking at this issue is that the IMO, which is trying to essentially bring everybody along, will be significantly behind where the parts of the world that have a higher risk profile or more resources available are. And so I'm not hopeful that there will ever be a position where the broader global maritime environment is able to follow the world's leading ports in quite the same way as we might like.
Thank you, Samuel. I think if we look at fragmentation across ports, and we do see, sort of competing data requests, ships. There's a lot of demand on ships for documentation and getting that documentation back to ports. John, just coming back to you, considering perspectives of a ship owner, do these sort of overlapping data requests, inspections, initiatives, etc., do they affect decision making on board ships as you see that? And what point does this become counterproductive?
I think it's one of the best questions. I think in the overall discussion, we have to pay due diligence and due consideration for the crew, because those are the people that make the difference at the end of the day. It's nice to sit over here and discuss about it, or in our offices, and at 6 o'clock going back to the families and planning what to do over the next weekend. But unless we understand the environment that the crew is operating, no matter what we do, we cannot improve really much. The loading and discharging operations typically are very short today. So within that time limit in the port, the crew has to do bunkering, possibly, cargo operations, an inspection from the port authorities, possibly from RightShip for a couple of days. The class may be there, if not the terminal. I wouldn't like to be there, quite honestly. And as we know, the profession of shipping is not the most promising career, right? It's a difficult career for good reasons. And we don't expect, and we don't get anyway, the highest quality of professionals, okay? Because those people, for good reason, have their own options on shore. And I think at the end of the day, most of those people go for the money to start with some exceptions who really are fond of shipping and that career. So we have to respect of what kind do we expect from those people. We raise standards, we raise inspections, one inspector after the other, data sending, data collecting. There are limits. And crew is by far the most important stuff in this. And I'm delighted to hear Steen as well addressing the problem. It's those people that we have to understand how they function. We have to put them ourselves in their shoes first.
Steen.
Couldn't agree more. We do, as a collective industry, put an incredible amount of demands on the seafarers. And we need to find better ways to address their workload. We do it at the same time as we essentially, for every hour we demand of the seafarer, we remove an hour that he potentially can get off the ship and walk in the park, so to say. So there is an enormous obligation on all of us to do what we can. And it's sort of, I think, a little bit back to the origin of your question, Andrew. How do we create structures where we trust each other with useful insights that we don't insist that we as individuals must create? And perhaps a share here is that we, as RightShip, we appreciate that a RightShip inspection is an intervention in the workings of the vessel. And generally, it should take place about once a year, depending a little bit on the overall performance or outcome of that inspection. So we acknowledge that we are part of that systemic challenge that is being put on the seafarers. It used to take us 14 hours to perform an inspection. And one of the steps we took in response to seeing whether we could reduce that was to introduce what is now known as the hybrid inspection. So essentially uplifting certificates and documents from the ship to shore days before the inspection takes place, and do that part of the inspection, so essentially review documents. That's about a 3-hour piece of work, which should then theoretically reduce the time spent on the ship from 14 to 11 hours. And I'm happy to share now that we are down to just below 10 hours on inspections that do hybrid. So that's tangible, but it's not enough. So next steps we have taken is we have initiated a project. We call it Vessel 365, and the intention is to essentially think, how can we 365 days of the year have useful and current inspection-like insights into the state of affairs from a safety and crew welfare point of view of the vessel. So instead of insisting that a person in safety equipment goes on board the vessel and obtains the evidence in person, which evidence could we potentially obtain via integrating with the ship and the ship management systems, so that we pipe some of that information into the oversight of the inspection regime every minute, every hour, every day, every quarter, whatever is relevant in each of the chapters of the RISQ standard. And the intention is then manifold. That should significantly reduce the time spent on the ship. Our dream is if we can get that down to maybe 5 or 6 hours instead of where we stand today. So we are well within a working day. And importantly, that data then becomes standardized for the industry so that we can share that with other parties. So part of the parallel conversation we have here is which insurance underwriters could potentially not go on board and do their physical insurance because they could be trusted by the data owner to obtain that data via an inspection that has already taken place. So voila, there you reduce or you remove that 5 or 6 hour inspection. And where can we share data with others in the industry that could be curious about the same? Where could we potentially lift insights into a standard around crew welfare where we could collaborate across ship types? So it's not just RightShip through its inspections of dry bulk vessels that potentially creates a crew welfare standard, but where we could collaborate with entities like OCIMF who have similar insights, and we could double that data up and make it available to the industry so we could have cross-learnings. So those are just a couple of examples where I think we need to appreciate that, as you say, John, the seafarer has a voice. We got to listen to the seafarers. We got to listen to the management companies and the owners and determine out of that what can we do to reduce a very simple metric like time spent, and standardize that data so it can be useful for many, many other parties across the industry.
Thank you, Steen. Yes, John, please.
I'm delighted to hear about this strategy, Steen, to reduce the time on board the ships, because I think it's a must. I mean, you can imagine a captain arriving early in the morning to Singapore, having crossed the straits, and address the cargo operations and the port inspections, etc., being awake for in excess of 24 hours. So it's a must, I think, that we have to help them do the job. And I want to share with you, if I may, because a couple of things, because I don't feel guilty about the status of the shipping industry, because I think it's a wider problem. The port state control of a very respected country tended in the past, I haven't recently heard about it, but most probably they continue. When they board the ship, they tell the crew, are you married? Do you have children? You may never see them again. Take a seat for a discussion. If you do it at your office, you can imagine what will happen, right? Talking about detentions, I did have an experience some years ago. A vessel, a tanker, was engaged for drugs because the smugglers put the drugs under the hull of the ship, right? It was the state involved, the various entities of the state. Then the result was that the captain and the chief mate, were in jail for 40 years in a police station in that country. And every evening at 7 o'clock, my phone was ringing. It was the captain. He wanted to talk to somebody. That happened for 4 years, every day, right? What did we, the society, do about it? Nothing. Finally, they came back to Greece. They're imprisoned in Greece because drug smuggling, which was not smuggling, it was not their fault, okay? It's as if it happens to your car when you take it in this afternoon. They ended up in jail here for a few months, and then they were pardoned by the president of the country. In another incident, the vessel was detained for 7 months by the state for ransom. What did we do as a society? Nothing. Is it the fault of the crew? Is it the fault of the industry? No, it's not the fault of the industry.
But I think a key point here, though, John, is the transparency of those things. And I think, okay, we can be acutely aware of those. We work in the industry, and perhaps others outside of the industry aren't acutely aware of those things. You know, I think transparency is key here. I mean, Steen, you mentioned around reducing time on ships, the ability to move or to have data that can be reutilized by other parties and avoid them having to go on the ships. Great, that reduces the workload on the ships and potentially reduces fragmentation, but more importantly, builds transparency within the industry. Samuel, I want to bring you back in. You made a comment around ports and potentially leaving sort of larger ports taking the charge and smaller ports being left behind. You know, in your view, how can we collaborate more across the industry to solve some of these things? And you know, what stops organisations or the system from actually letting go to be able to collaborate more?
Look, Andrew, it's a great question. One of the things I'm continually struck by, and it sort of comes out, I think, from the discussion today, how despite the industry, I think, being broadly very collaborative, how differently different parts of the industry see risk and how differently they see the ways in which those risks can be managed, and how little time we spend really thinking about the magnitude of risks and the order of difference that exists between different entities in the industry. So let me give you, an obvious example. For an owner of a small number of vessels, this question around crew welfare, the cost of compliance, and the ability to invest in systems that might make that more efficient, might make that more effective for that business. It's a very acute question for that particular owner, for that particular management company. But that small number of vessels to a port or to a terminal owner can result in just the same amount of risk to that infrastructure, to the welfare and the security of that port, as a much larger owner and vessel can. And so I think the answer to your question is really how we spend more time thinking about how we are transparent and generous in the sharing of information, how we are much more open about what is driving behaviour. So when crews are hit with significant information requests, they're given more context and understanding as to why that might be requested. And that we work much more openly on some of these issues rather than forever seeing them through our own particular prisms and issues. So in my case, ports care an enormous amount about the security of their channels and of their navigational infrastructure. That drives a huge amount of this type of activity. But much, much less time than should be spent is devoted to what that impact that has on crew. And so harbour masters all around the world will think nothing of loading up crews with huge amounts of information requests because all they see is the channel. But those crew don't necessarily understand in the same way why that channel is important and why that risk is being managed in the way it is. And so I think, Andrew, it sounds a bit trite, but so much of this would be much more effectively discussed and talked about and managed if we actually came at this with a genuine attempt to understand the risk that everybody's looking to manage and tried to find ways to do it more efficiently. If we think about how this whole issue has evolved over the last 20 years, 10 years ago, it was all about who's got the cheapest charter rates. And then we've slowly realized that actually is a bit counterproductive if you're a charter party, because if you get the cheapest charter rates, you probably get the cheapest ship, and that cheapest ship puts your infrastructure at risk. And so you start thinking about, okay, how do I verify not only the cost of my charter, but also the quality of my charter? But now we're at a position where I think it's quite fair, and I agree with the other panelists, it's gotten somewhat bigger than it can be managed. And we now need to spend time thinking about how we can do that efficiently, how we can leverage technology to actually reduce the burden on crews, how we can verify data so it doesn't get asked for by the same entity 5 different times in 5 slightly different ways. But we're never going to be able to do that unless we actually understand the basis of why that information and data is important, align on that, and are transparent about those underlying drivers.
Thank you, Samuel. I'm just watching your time. We've got about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to turn us into a bit of a forward-looking perspective here. So Samuel, I'm going to stick with you whilst we have you. If we were to reconvene in 3 years from now, what would need to be different for us to say credibly that collaboration and transparency have actually translated into more efficiency, better trust?
Look, I would really love to see best practice in the management of vetting and pre-port verification being shared. There are some management companies out there that are doing an absolutely phenomenal job. They're investing in technology. They're not just kind of wringing their hands at the impact that's having on crew. They're actually going, okay, well, how do we give the crew better systems, AI tools, better documentation so that they can manage that more effectively? Other management or ship owners are coming at the charter parties and saying, hey, we understand you have all these verification requirements. They have a cost on us. We need to add additional people. Are you prepared to pay for that? And often the answer is yes. And so for me, best practice is those companies out there that are at the very top of this, being transparent about it. And for the charter parties actually being prepared to support that by putting money and time behind it as well. It's all very good for people to expect this of management companies and a crew, but you actually have to pay for it as well. So in my mind, if we can be here in 3 years' time and we've seen that best practice being shared, if we're seeing companies being prepared to invest in tools to make it more efficient, and we're seeing shippers getting behind that in terms of being prepared to pay for it in charter rates, that's how I think we know we're actually moving forward.
Great. Thank you, Simon. Just sticking with that theme, John, maybe I can come to you. How do we take those best practices that Samuel mentioned and ensure that the leading companies and the best practices that they're doing are actually filtering down to the rest of the industry? That's my first question. And my second is, again, if we reconvene in 3 years, what would need to change for us to say we've done a great job?
Do we have to wait for 3 years?
Absolutely not.
I will stick, if I may, to transparency. Of course, transparency sounds good, there's no doubt about it, providing we talk within logical limits. But unless we elevate transparency to the highest levels, we cannot expect the lower level to be transparent. What do I mean about it? When I was chairman of Intercargo, I took the initiative to write twice to all MOUs, asking them that they should consider the establishment of self-assessment entities within their own organizations, where we could put on the floor our problems with the various inspectors and inspections, etc. Surprisingly, twice, all of them responded that they don't need them because they're very good. How could they assess it? They knew it, right? And I think there is a lot of work to be done to the higher levels, not to the poor crew, as it stands. And we could establish it as an objective if you want to start discussing publicly about it and force IMO to do it. Why don't they do it? I don't know. The IMO has an accident reporting system, an accident analysis system, If you look at the reports of from time to time, I haven't seen it actually for a couple of years at least, a number of countries never file an analysis, a casualty report at the IMO. I asked the IMO once many years ago, why don't they make public that list? And they don't want to embarrass people. So transparency has two faces, like a coin. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And I think, a key theme that I'm pulling from this is that trust is the missing currency in all of this, and that, that is central to being able to unlock some of this value. In our discussion ahead of this, we spoke around the potential of a single source of truth with information flowing in that everyone can access, improving transparency and potentially reducing that fragmentation. I think we could sit and discuss a lot around aspects of IMO and other systems that are out there and how we can draw everyone together. Just in view of time, Steve, let me come to you. 3 years from now, what does good look like?
3 years from now, everybody in the industry will have signed up to DBCE and will be actively doing dry BMS audits. So I had to do that, right? We have Michael Poon in the room, the MD for DBCE, and yesterday it would be remiss of me, right? We're in Intercargo's hotbed, and we've got plenty of participation today also from Intercargo. We made a partnership between Intercargo and RightShip, and the whole essence was essentially bringing the industry together around a standard that would have great impact on owners, managers, and provide great transparency to charterers. And some charterers have already, long time ago, made the dry BMS standard a absolutely integral part of their decision-making workflows, and it's wonderful to see. Now, as an industry, I'd love to see, when we fast forward, that this has really had the uptake that it deserves, that we have come together and benefited across the industry from what this standard does, and continue to contribute to its uptake. Very quickly, I would also like to think that if we meet in a couple of years, we will have been able to set up the transparency in feeling comfortable and evidencing why, that we can share data and we can use that data in AI models that will help us across the industry make far more informed and faster decisions. So this is an area of discomfort because most of us are learning through what AI can do, and it's very natural to then be skeptical, but I think we need to come together to set up these data infrastructure structures that can allow us to go tick, 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 tick. We all agree that this is the way to handle it. Without that, it's really difficult to truly collaborate.
Thank you, Steen. And I know we never had a chance to talk much in this session about the Dry Bulk Centre of Excellence, the Dry BMS, but I think it's a great example of how we're actually trying to forge industry collaboration, reduce transparency. This is a joint industry initiative. We have the support of the charterers. We've got ourselves as RightShip and Intercargo, trying to drive consistency and transparency across the industry. I think it's a great example to finish on, and I think we're going to hear more a bit later. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention this morning. Thank you for bearing with us with the tech glitches that we had. We got there in the end, which was great. Please do show some appreciation for my wonderful panelists. Thank you. Samuel, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.